Hey, this is Lee and Brad, and today we are going to talk about an issue that's very near and dear to the heart of BFKP, sponsor-controlled buildings, particularly condos today. Brad, so do you want to get the exciting conversation going?
Sure. So we frequently hear from unit owners in newly constructed condo buildings in the city with a problem of one kind or another. These can be problems regarding board communication, issues concerning management of the building, or also governance of the building, including the holding of meetings, votes, and financial affairs. And of course, in these newly constructed buildings, very often the building, and more specifically the board of the building, remains controlled by the sponsor, which is the developer that actually constructed the building, the condominium. So to start, Lee, maybe you could sort of explain what does it mean for a building or a board to be sponsor controlled?
Well, you kind of stole some of my thunder because you said the sponsor was the developer. That's um, part of the answer. So, there's mostly two ways that you can buy condominiums in New York. You could either buy them directly from the owner, resale unit, or you can buy them from the entity which developed and then sold are selling the units in the building. And they're called the sponsor because condominium units are considered securities offerings and they are the sponsor of those offerings. So when you're purchasing from the sponsor, typically that means that you're going to be walking into a building that is controlled by a condominium board made up of either members of the sponsor or affiliates of members of the sponsor. In any event, typically the sponsor is responsible for designating, if not all of the seats in the condominium board, the majority of the seats. And that's important because the condominium board is the body that's responsible for the day-to-day governance of the building. And by virtue of the fact that they're also responsible for hiring and overseeing the management company, they're also responsible for the day-to-day management of the building. So when you're walking into a sponsor controlled board, you're not going to have unit owners who are overseeing the day-to-day governance, day-to-day management. You're going to have either members of the sponsor entity or affiliates of the sponsor entity.
And when you say sponsor entity, of course, if I'm not mistaken, most sponsors that construct these buildings are entities, LLCs usually, that are set up for the purpose of owning and constructing this building, but they are generally or almost always affiliated with a larger developer entity. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. If it's a one-off for the first time that an offering is being made, then maybe it's the first company that the principals have ever created. But yeah, typically you have a parent development company, and that parent company will set up LLCs to serve as sponsors for its various offerings.
Right. All right. So you've explained what does it mean to have a sponsor controlled board. They are either the entirety or a majority of the board. Um, I think every building is probably different. Every set of governing documents for every building is different. But in generalities, how long does a building, a new condominium, usually remain sponsor controlled? And how does the building go from sponsor control eventually to unit owner control?
Look, the offering plan controls. So it's really if for each building, you have to look at the offering plan to see how long the sponsor control period is going to last. But typically, what we see most often is it's going to be the earlier of two things. The earlier of 5 years, usually 5 years is the standard measuring stick, or when a certain percentage of the units have been sold. Can be anywhere from 70% of the units. Sometimes we see it as much as 95% of the units. Sometimes it's all of the units have to be sold. So it's usually an earlier of between those two things. Suffice to say, if you're buying at the beginning of the sponsor control period, you're going to be dealing with a sponsor control board for a long time. If you're buying towards the end, then it might not be as much of a concern.
And of course, somebody buying a condo unit directly from the sponsor during the sponsor control period is going to obviously be moving into a sponsor controlled building, but the same would apply, I think, if somebody is buying from another unit owner during the life of the sponsor control period. Is that correct?
Sure, yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that's not quite so frequent, but that's certainly a possibility.
Right. All right. So how about I mentioned at the beginning that we get a lot of calls about this, right? Unit owners or sometimes groups of unit owners and sponsor controlled buildings that have kind of a recurring set of questions or issues that they want to speak to us about. Again, recognizing every building's different, could you explain a little bit about some of the general categories of problems or issues that owners and sponsor controlled buildings tend to come to us with?
Well, look, I'm going to make a point at the outset, which is typically what we receive phone calls from are individual owners who usually have a very narrow, specific issue in their building. Um, Punch list items have not been taken care of. There's a repair that needs to be made. It's not being made in an expeditious fashion. Um, the unit wasn't delivered in the condition that it was supposed to be delivered in. It looks different than the unit they were promised. That's the typical phone call that we get. When you dig a little bit deeper in some of these buildings, you find that the issue that that single unit owner is confronting is typically being dealt with by many owners in the building. It's usually not just a one-off. But most condo owners are not thinking about how is this impacting the building as a whole. They're thinking about getting their unit in habitable fashion, which is understandable. So
Right.
that's the most typical phone call. Usually, I'll call it like a cousin of that problem is the issue's not being addressed. Either it's not being addressed fast enough, the board's not getting back to them, the management company's not getting back to them. It's being addressed in like a half-hearted or sloppy fashion. So there's a superficial attempt to resolve the issue. It's not fully being resolved, or they're being totally ignored. And they don't know what to do because there's not really a functioning board that they can go to complain. So I'd say most frequently it's single issues tied in with communication issues because the board and or management is not being as responsive. Sometimes when you dig a little bit deeper, there are bigger issues in the building. So someone's having a problem with their ventilation and they think it's contained to their unit, but there's a broader systems issue that needs to be looked at. So really it goes beyond unit specific. But our first call is typically unit specific with these kind of communication issues tied in.
Right. So you get a call from somebody, they have a problem. The board, and of course, these are board members that have fiduciary duties to the unit owners. They are supposed to act in the best interest of the unit owners, right? But of course, there's kind of an issue there because they are the developer that put up the building.
Or,
So,
or affiliated with a developer. Yeah.
or affiliated or employed by or officers of the developer, or something like
Your second cousin once removed. That
which
does happen.
I think, yeah. Um, so you get a call from somebody in that situation. You sort of described it as a non-functioning board. They have these duties, but in practical situations, very often they are not acting to make the lives of the unit owners better. What are some of the general ways? And this is obviously a huge topic we could talk about for hours, but what are the general tools that unit owners or groups of unit owners can avail themselves of um, if they're trying to get something done in a sponsor controlled, or I'll say maybe a more difficult or reticent to act sponsor controlled building?
Sure. I do want to say one thing, which is I want to throw a caveat out there. We know some developers, you know, there are many there are many sponsors who take control of the board and do the best they can. Being a board member overall is tough, you know, even for unit owners. It's a second job and it can be a full-time job, particularly in a very busy building. We obviously, most of the calls we receive, the sponsor doesn't fit neatly into that particular category, but I do want to throw that caveat out there. You kind of stole my thunder again, because you said groups of owners.
Keep doing that. I'm really sorry.
Okay, no, I think we're of the same mind on this. So you're spoiling the ending before we get there, but that's fine. I think the most typical playbook that you'll hear as to how to deal with this issue. We've seen articles in the New York Times about this. other real estate publications, the typical advice is hire a lawyer, write a letter, make demands, try to resolve the issue. That can work. It really depends on the sponsor, and it depends on the magnitude of the issue. If the issue is going to be really expensive to resolve, it's going to probably not work. You're going to need to be a little more aggressive than that, or you're going to need to be creative. Here's where creativity comes in, and it speaks to what you said before in your question, which is groups of owners. One of the reasons, maybe this is the more nefarious side of my brain, but one of the more one of the reasons why a sponsor control board is so useful for a sponsor is it prevents collective action. It prevents a board from saying, hey, you constructed this part of the building incorrectly, or when you sold this unit, it didn't look like that in the plans that were filed. It looked differently. Instead, they can divide and conquer and deal with issues as they arise, and they don't have to deal with a collective effort, which is far more difficult to deal with. So I think typically, if there are issues in the building that are beyond small material defect issues, the best course of action is to speak to your neighbors. We have clients who organize on Slack, on WhatsApp, who have meetings, who have a group chat. To be a little careful about what you say, because you never know if it's going to be litigation. But the best way to confront the issue is to figure out what's going on in other units, to share ideas, to share a plan, and hopefully pool resources to hire professionals as a collective to deal with the issues afflicting the collective. Going to be the most cost-efficient way to pursue change, going to be the most effective way to pursue change, because now you have a law firm or group of attorneys who are aligned in what they're seeking, who can start one chain of communication with the sponsor and or their counsel, and who can seek specific definitive changes that are not just going to solve day-to-day issues, but hopefully, it might take a little while, but hopefully solve broader issues afflicting the building. So I think the number one way to deal with this is to find like-minded people in your building and work together.
Organize, right? It's sort of the way to overcome. I think the two takeaways from what you just said are decision making, right? You don't have a board that has built-in mechanisms for making decisions, and you don't have a board that is funded through official channels. So to organize, find a way to make decisions as a group, and to pool resources, I think from what we've seen is a critical step in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, I want to be careful not to use the phrase shadow board. So I didn't say that. But if I was to buy in a sponsor controlled condominium, the first thing that I would do is I would set up some type of group chat, and I would tell people, let's figure out our own system as unit owners to run this building and to convey issues to the sponsor. And let's be organized in our own, because we can't rely on the sponsor to be organized. We can't rely on them to even be doing anything other than trying to sell units. That's they're profit minded. That's their goal. So that's what I would do. And when individuals call us, that's typically, every situation is different, but that's typically one of the first things that we advise as well.
Right. Well, we obviously have a lot more to say about this. I think we'll probably do some more of these videos in the future, but I think we will leave it there for today.
Bye, Brad. See you in the hallway.